The movie opens in 15th century England during a period of civil war in Britain, as the English kingdom struggles to defeat the rebel forces. The English recently defeated the Scottish army, and among those who survived is the young Englishman Henry Percy of the Hotspur family. He notices a badly wounded enemy soldier crawling on the ground and says that he's going in the wrong direction. Percy then impales him with a single stroke of his sword and ends his suffering. Later we see the Hotspur family dining at the same table as King Henry IV, a sickly old man and a slovenly drunkard. The king asks if they have taken any prisoners for him, but Percy replies no, because the king has not paid the ransom for one of his cousins, who remains in Welsh captivity. The king dismisses the hostage as nothing more than a rebel and a traitor, which enrages Percy, who begins to insult him. The king then threatens to cut off his head, prompting an angry Percy to walk away in the middle of the dinner. Afterwards, the king concludes that Percy will soon betray him, yet at the same time wishes his own son possessed such determination. Elsewhere, we see the king's eldest son, Henry V, who is disillusioned with the court and disgusted by its corruption and endless wars. So he avoids royal duties and spends his time drinking, brawling, and wandering the taverns with his friend Sir John Falstaff. One day, Henry is approached by a royal attendant who claims that the king is gravely ill and wishes to see his eldest son. But Henry shows no concern for his father and instead spends his time at the tavern having fun. The next morning, he is found sleeping beside a prostitute until John arrives and sends the woman away. John persuades Henry to pay his father a visit, warning he will regret it for the rest of his life if the king dies without speaking to him. Upon hearing this, Henry reluctantly agrees and makes his way to the court, where the assembled lords rise to greet him with a standing ovation. The king then declares that his time is running short and an heir must be named. Despite the fact that Henry is his eldest son, he refuses to give him the crown, stating that it will go to his younger brother, Thomas. Henry receives the news without surprise or disappointment, for he never desired the throne anyway. He also learns that Percy of the Hotspur family has turned traitor, and Thomas will lead the royal army into battle against him tomorrow. The next day, Thomas is seen preparing for battle with his army when Henry suddenly arrives and surprises everyone. He declares that he will end this conflict without needless bloodshed, for he does not wish to see his brother or countless men die. Henry then dispatches an emissary to Percy with a message challenging him to single combat. The message soon reaches Percy, who eagerly accepts the duel, even as his father pleads with him not to. Not long after, Percy arrives at the battlefield, and the duel between him and Henry begins. Both demonstrate incredible skill, and they soon lose their swords and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat. However, after a long and intense struggle, Henry draws a hidden dagger and ultimately stabs Percy in the throat, leaving both sides in shock and horror. Despite the victory, Thomas appears disappointed, believing that his brother has interfered with his affairs and stolen his glory. But Henry points out that he was not seeking fame but merely protecting his brother, who could have died. Following this, Henry returns to his former life, spending his days drinking heavily alongside John. However, one day he is approached by William, who is the chief justice and chief advisor to the king. He informs the prince that the king is dying and urges him to come to the court to be crowned, as the nation will descend into chaos without a leader. A hesitant Henry asks William to approach his brother, but William shockingly reveals that Thomas died in Welsh territory while attempting to quell a local rebellion. This fills Henry with anger, and he immediately heads to the castle, where he confronts his father on his deathbed. Calling him a monster, he pulls the blankets off the old man and is shocked to see his body covered in sores. Before he can express further anger, the king declares his final will and pleads with Henry to take the throne as the next king of England. Upon hearing this, all the royal staff kneel before their new king in a show of loyalty, and Henry has no choice but to accept the heavy responsibility. Soon after, the old king passes away, and Henry is proclaimed King of England. Some servants then go to Henry's quarters to retrieve his belongings and force John there to leave. John is shocked to learn that his friend has now become the king, but he's disappointed that he had to hear it from a servant. In the evening, a grand celebration is held to honor the new king, during which he is presented with gifts from European sovereigns allied with England. From the King of Bohemia, Henry receives a cup, which he in turn gives to his sister, the Queen of Denmark. The King of Venice sends a mechanical bird, which Henry gifts to his cousin, Cambridge. Then comes another gift from the French prince, which is just a toy ball. The crowd falls silent at the sight, but Henry doesn't make it a big deal and declares that he will keep this gift for himself. Afterward, William points out to Henry that the ball is actually an insult to the Kingdom of England and urges him to respond to this outrage. Henry, however, has no intention of waging war on France. Instead, he proposes putting aside their conflicts and seeking reconciliation between the two nations. He plans to govern in a manner opposite to his father's, and even suggests the payment of the ransom for Percy's cousin. The next day, Henry is visited by the Archbishop, who questions the legitimacy of Charles VI of France's reign. Henry could lay claim to it, and it turns out that France had always been his father's ambition, and they could continue on to Jerusalem after that. However, Henry refuses this suggestion and makes it clear that he has no intention of destroying the countries. While William praises his prudence, he also mentions how France mocks England and warns that the people are becoming resentful. Elsewhere, John is seen drinking in a tavern, where the innkeeper begins pressing him for money. She even mocks him, pointing out how his privileges have been stripped away now that his friend has become king. Days later, a French emissary is captured, and he confesses that he was sent by the King of France himself to attempt to assassinate Henry. In exchange for his confession, the emissary requests political asylum, which Henry grants by his own decree. This enrages the royal lords, who strongly urge Henry to wage war against France. However, the young king still refuses and instead writes a threatening letter to the French king. He warns that if France truly wants war with England, it must send troops rather than cowardly assassins. Henry even places several cannonballs in the same box that once carried the toy ball and sends it back. Soon, a message arrives from the French king, claiming that no assassins were sent, but the English royal lords refuse to believe him and continue to pressure Henry. One day, an envoy from the French king arrives and meets with Cambridge and another royal official, Lord Grey. The Frenchman seeks their support to turn against Henry, so the two men then report the visit to William, explaining what the French agent proposed. Lord Grey immediately voices concern that a drunkard and coward would make a poor ruler, while Cambridge doubts Henry's mental acuity. Next, William goes to meet Henry and explains the importance of making decisions that can be difficult but will unite the country. After much consideration, Henry returns to the palace and informs everyone that from that moment on, they will be at war with France. He entrusts Lord Grey and Cambridge with the task of delivering this message to the enemy. However, he also orders that their heads be executed the following day as punishment for conspiring against him. The next day, Henry watches the execution of both men with a heavy heart, as Cambridge is actually his cousin and was once a close friend. Afterwards, he goes to a tavern where he meets John and apologizes for abandoning him over the past few weeks. He then asks John to accompany him as one of his advisors, since he doesn't trust anyone in the court. John agrees to help, but on the condition that his friends settle his debts at the taverns, which Henry accepts without hesitation. The next day, Henry introduces John to all the lords in court, announcing that he has been appointed as his campaign chief because of his experience in combat. Most of the lords are deeply unhappy that the king would choose a drunkard to lead such an important mission, but they have no choice but to agree. After making the necessary preparations, Henry mobilizes his army and sets sail with the English fleet for France. They eventually arrive at the coastal village of Harfleur and are shocked to find that the place has already been abandoned. They soon learn that soldiers, civilians, and local nobles had taken refuge in the nearby stronghold, which the English were now besieging. The English begin bombarding it with locally constructed counterweight trebuchets, continuing day after day, yet the French still refuse to come out, and even though the building burns, it doesn't collapse. After a few days, the English begin pressuring Henry to advance and storm the city, but he's reluctant to risk the lives of his soldiers. He then asks for John's opinion, who advises waiting for the enemy to surrender, as he also doesn't favor shedding blood. This displeases the other soldiers, who worry about being starved or dying from disease. But soon, their fears prove unnecessary, as the French eventually surrender. The women and children are released, while the men are taken prisoner, and a garrison is established in the captured castle. Soon, Henry receives news that the Prince of France, Louis, has arrived and requested a meeting with the English king. Henry goes to meet him at his camp at night, and quickly realizes that Louis has no intention of surrendering. The prince begins mocking Henry for his former life as a drunkard, and then insults him with a series of inappropriate remarks. He even threatens to kill Henry and bury him under a little French tree. Henry, however, does not respond to any of the provocations and promptly leaves the camp. The next day, the English army advances deeper into the country, and once encamped, we soon see 3 English kids who head off alone into the woods nearby. Suddenly, one of the children is brutally surprised and stabbed in the back while collecting water from a stream. The other 2 begin to flee, but one is fatally struck by a bolt from a crossbow. This horrifies the 3rd child, but he's soon found by Louis, who assures him that he won't harm him and asks him to deliver a gift to his king. Shortly after, the shaken kid returns to the English camp with his friend's severed head, which horrifies everyone. This enrages Henry, so he approaches John and orders that the guards be doubled at night and that all the French prisoners be executed with their bodies impaled on stakes by the river. But John refuses to carry out such a mass execution and argues that Henry himself is not the kind of man capable of such atrocities. The next day, the troops continue advancing until they reach the foot of a slope near the village of Agincourt. Henry sends his fastest rider to scout the other side of the hill. The young man obeys, and upon arriving, he finds a large number of French troops camped there. He soon returns to Henry and informs him that the French forces are much larger and occupy a better position. It turns out that most of the English soldiers are exhausted and many are sick. So most of the lords suggest retreating so at least they won't have to sacrifice their men in vain. However, John suddenly intervenes with a plan that uses the weather to their advantage. He predicts that heavy rain will fall tonight, turning the ground into thick mud and making movement difficult for the heavily armored French soldiers. He suggests sending a small group of strong, heavily armed soldiers first to lure the French into the muddy area. This would be followed by a larger wave of faster troops who can move quickly on the slippery ground, while English archers on the sides fire longbows at the trapped enemy. Although most of the other advisors do not like the idea, Henry decides to follow John's plan, stating that if it rains, they will fight, and if it does not, they will return to England. Surprisingly, that night, as John predicted, it begins to rain heavily. In the morning, John decides to lead the first assault and dons heavy armor. He advises Henry not to engage too early in the fight, no matter what happens on the battlefield. However, Henry, wanting to save thousands of men in battle, decides to act on his own and arrives at the French camp. He proposes a one-on-one duel with Louis, and whoever wins will rule France. However, the arrogant prince refuses his offer and asks if Henry is afraid to face his army. With no other choice, Henry returns to his army and delivers an inspiring speech, urging his men to battle. The English troop, led by John, advances with the front line and draws in the French knights. Meanwhile, Henry heads to the forest and waits for the right moment to strike. As soon as the French approach, a rain of English arrows falls on them. A brutal slaughter erupts in the mud, with faces and armor crushed and bones broken. John receives a blow that knocks off his helmet, losing more and more breath as the soldiers crowd together. Henry orders another volley of arrows before charging out to fight with his men on the battlefield. In the end, Henry's decision to heed John's advice proves successful, and with the battle almost over, Louis unexpectedly appears on the battlefield and challenges Henry to a duel. However, Louis barely takes his first steps toward his challenger before he tragically slips on the muddy ground. This creates a very embarrassing situation, so the English soldiers repeatedly stab Louis to death, and the battle is finally won. After the battle, Henry finds his friend John among the fallen, probably dead from suffocation. This shatters him, and in his grief and anger, he shows no mercy to the French prisoners and orders them all executed. Next, Henry proceeds to the castle to meet with King Charles VI of France to discuss the terms of his surrender. The old king is willing to give up his kingdom and also speaks of the strained relationship he shared with his son. He also offers Henry the hand of his daughter, Princess Catherine, in marriage, effectively uniting France and England under a single crown. Henry accepts the French sovereign's proposal and returns to England while grieving for his friend. William thus offers his condolences for John's death and comforts him in his grief. Days later, Henry's wedding day arrives, and a jubilant crowd gathers outside the palace in England. The young king meets with Catherine, but she makes it clear that she will not submit to him and that he must earn her respect. She then asks why he attacked their country, so Henry reveals how her father sent an assassin to kill him. However, Catherine insists that her father never sent an assassin, and that all he ever wanted was peace. Henry then brings up the toy ball Louis sent to mock him, but Catherine says her brother is too stupid to do something like that. He then claims that her father's rule is illegitimate, but she retorts that Henry himself is the son of a usurper. She insults him further, calling him a foolish young man and easy to deceive. Upon hearing this, a stunned Henry goes to meet William, who is getting ready for the celebration. The king then asks how much land he owns now and how much he will receive after conquering France, but William replies that it is yet to be determined. Henry then asks how the French assassin came to find him, but the old man grows nervous and begins telling conflicting stories about how the assassin approached him, none of which make much sense. In the end, Henry finally realizes that William has been manipulating everything all along, and that it was he who plotted the entire scheme for his own benefit. The old man eventually admits this and claims that he gave the king what he had always wanted, to become a ruler respected by his followers and to secure the peace he had always wished. William then begs for forgiveness and prostrates himself at Henry's feet, but the king refuses to show mercy and stabs him in the neck to death. In the final scene, Henry goes to Catherine and says he will ask nothing of her except that she always speaks to him honestly and clearly. Catherine agrees, and the two take each other's hands as the people chant the name of King Henry to celebrate his victory over the French.